East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance. And I'm so glad to see you tonight for a very special program that we have put together. We're going to start our program with a musical introduction. And we're going to feature the Epirus solo clarinet playing of Kostas Skarpetos.
I play folklore music. I try to play a little bit more from Epirus, from Ioannina, and between I'm going to sing a little bit. Ali Pasha, ore palatito, o barbaro.
Tonight, we're going to have a presentation on someone who's very important, not only to Albanian history, but also Greek history and Ottoman history, and the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. He's an important person within a lot of different cultures for many different reasons. I'm just going to basically do a little bit of introduction about Ali, and then I will introduce our speakers tonight, Electra and Catherine, who will speak to different perspectives of Ali. So let's start from the beginning. Ali was known as of Yanina, and he was an Albanian Muslim ruler who served as an Ottoman Pasha from about 1788 in the Pashalik of Yanina. Just so we can get a perspective in terms of the Pashalik of Yanina and where it's located. So this is the Pashalik of Yanina, basically. But Ali, besides being the Pasha of this particular area, he did in fact control various areas, including the western part of Thessaly, including parts of the western part of Macedonia, and also through his son Veli and his other son, basically controlled what is now, I guess, the middle part of Albania and what is now the Peloponnesos area. So, effectively, Ali, during the period of the height of Ali, controlled what is basically the landmass of most of the current Hellenic Republic, but also of southern Albania. He took advantage of a weak Ottoman government. He seized and expanded territory through a series of shifting alliances, constantly considering what was better for him and his advantage over time. And he formed those alliances at times with Napoleon, for example, to get some Ionian areas. And then when Napoleon basically made a treaty with the Czar, he shifted his alliance and basically went with the United Kingdom. Although his native language was Albanian, he did speak the Hellenic language fluently. and the Hellenic language was the official language of his court. He had a very colorful career and belongs, as we said, not only to the Albanian history, but also Hellenic and Turkish history. Under his government, in effect, based in Ioannina, Ioannina became the literary capital of the Hellenic Renaissance, with colleges, libraries, and schools flourishing and enjoying independent endowments. For those of you who know history, obviously, the Library of Ioannina itself became the foundation of the Library of the Hellenic Republic. It was an area, again, that had a renaissance, a Hellenic renaissance during the period. He was a very complex figure, known for his diplomatic and administrative skills, his interest in modern ideas and concepts, his legendary cunning, his religious neutrality, which is very important. Even though he was a Muslim, in his court, he had both Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians, as well as a significant Judaic community which existed within the Ioannina area. He was noted for his vengefulness and harshness, and he garnered sort of admiration when he was around, as well as condemnment, actually. And historians, even into today, are basically, pro and con, depending on which angle you're coming from. He was known for his some of his atrocities, which are very well known, including at Gardiki, for executing the famous Hellenic cleft Katso Andonis, for the murder. Many people know him really for the murder of Kira Frosini and some of the other prominent women of Ioannina. And a lot of his actions are with a great body of folk songs and poetry. Lord Byron, and that's why that relates to the title. Lord Byron did visit the court of Ali and made famous in his work Childe Harold. He was there in 1809. So Ali was a very important person, as we indicated, and in terms of Lord Byron, he said that his court was superior in wealth, refinement, and learning to any other Hellenic town. He had an impact on the Hellenic Revolution, keeping Turkish troops occupied who were trying to depose him, and of course with the Sudiotes. So I want to touch a little bit upon that particular issue as an introduction. Because many people will say, well, why Ali? Why are we talking about Ali? And many people, and I remember, quite frankly, I wanted to have an event on Ali, and I was very fortunate, at least, to have Catherine speak at one of the events that was with the consulate relating to the Hellenic Revolution, and having her speak about Ali and the start of the revolution. And every time I would mention the name Ali, everyone's face would basically glaze over. This particular event that we're having tonight, I had, when I was at the Hellenic American Chamber of Commerce, I wanted to do this type of event, but again, when you mention Ali, it becomes a problematic issue for some people. In fact, when I was in Greece a few times and I would mention that I wanted to do an event on Ali, people would go basically crazy. They said, how dare you, how could you have an event on Ali? But I don't think they really understood who Ali was, and basically some of the things that related to their particular history also. And we're fortunate now, at least, that with some of the younger historians in Greece, that they're getting more into the Ottoman period and really starting to make people understand the importance of some of the things that took place, not only under his particular reign, but also during the Ottoman period itself. So let me talk a little bit about the Sudiotes, because they become important to the conversation, and also a little bit about the Hellenic Revolution. So if we go back to the map, although Ali controlled this area when it became his Pashalik in 1788, he did have to contend with certain people within the area. He didn't control all the regions within the area. You had, for example, up in the north, you had in Humada, You had one of the, what they call the warrior societies. There were three warrior societies that they talk about in Hellenic history. One had to do with Himara, the other one had to do with the Suli area, and the third one had to do with the Mani area. These are the three major warrior societies within the Ottoman Empire. So to a certain degree, the Sudotes who were in the Pashalik of Yanina were people who had, from about the 1650s when they started, and they were basically clan-based type organization, and they had expanded and controlled really the Sudot mountains. And they became basically the rulers of that particular area under the Pashalik. They still paid their taxes to the Sultan. There was no issues with the Sultan, but they controlled basically the population of that area, which was for the most part Orthodox Christian. There was a series of armies, Ottoman armies, that tried to suppress, subject the Sudotes. They failed for a period of about 100 years, from about the early 1700s to the latter 1700s. They tried to overtake them. They couldn't do it. And Ali himself, when he took over the Pashalik, wanted to control the Sudotes. He ended up eventually destroying or taking over, let's say, the Himara. But he had problems with the Sudotes until a series of wars that he had. And then finally in 1803, he was able to conquer Suli and in effect caused the Sudot population to go across into Corfu. Keep that in the back of your minds because I think it becomes very important to the conversation. So let's talk a little bit about the time period. His power was really so great that he alarmed the Sultan, who was Mahmud II in that particular time, and who ascended to the throne in 1808. And Mahmud really wanted to, in any way, weaken Ali. He had one of his opportunities, basically, based on the universal indignation that took place with Ali's murder of the people of Gadiki, where he basically massacred the whole population relating to an incident that took place with his mother when he was a small child. So one of these steps that Mahmud took around 1812 was basically, as I indicated, Veli, who was Ali's son, controlled the Morea, the Peloponnesos, and he basically took him out of the position of being Pasha of the Morea, and basically sent him to a more insignificant Pashalik in Larissa, and then in about 1819 sent him to an even more insignificant Pashalik of Lepanto, which we know as Napoleon. Ali knew what was going on during these particular time periods. He knew what was happening, but among the things that what was in the back of his mind was, yes, he had a lot of power, etc., but also he had a problem with Ismail Pashu Bey, who was related to him, and when he was younger, was actually in his court, but now he was in Constantinople, and basically had also had the friendship of Mahmud. So Ali took these steps that were taking place with the Sultan as being things that were instigated to a certain degree by Ismail. And in February of 1820, and start thinking about these dates because they become very important historically. In 1820, in February, 3 Albanians appeared in Constantinople and basically were trying to assassinate Ismail. They failed in their assassination, and when that happened, they were basically captured, they were interrogated, and the 3 assassins said Ali sent them to assassinate Ismail, and nothing would happen to them basically because of the power of Ali within a court of Constantinople. That, of course, further infuriated the Sultan, but also they gave him a particular angle now to start doing something about what he really wanted to do. So he immediately wiped out or killed the 3 assassins. He accused Ali of high treason, and then he told him to come within 40 days to report to him in Constantinople. And then he took the Pashalik of Yanina and gave it to Ismail. At the same time he did that, he asked, of course, Ali to come. Ali, of course, was not going to come. Ali had built up this army, etc., of all types of warriors both Albanian, Hellenic, and so he was, in his mind, he was ready to go into independence, basically. So he was really the herald of independence of that particular area. The Sultan gave the head of the military to go against Ali to Ismail. He got his pashas, his various pashas together, and they went basically into the area of the Pashalik of Yanina to take it over, and for Ismail then to claim the Pashalik of Yanina. Ali had behind him not only obviously the local Albanians, but also the local Orthodox population who were part of his court. When we talk about the court of Ali Pasha, we're talking about a court that was multi-ethnic, multicultural, and really among the fiercest warriors of the whole Ottoman Empire. As a matter of fact, they were internationally known, including the Sudotes and all the other people who, many of them fled into Corfu that I mentioned, and who actually fought in foreign armies. So the armies basically went against Ali, and we're talking about now around February or so of 1820. Remember that the revolution, the Hellenic Revolution, started around March of 1821. By the summertime of 1820, still he had those loyal forces that he had. Some of the forces that were within the Pashalik of Yanina went towards also the Sultan, because don't forget at that time there's a lot of money transferred back and forth to all types of mercenary fighters. And then the Sultan got the idea that one of the groups that he wanted to come to his side and who absolutely hated Ali, was the Sudots. The Sudots at that time were in Corfu for about 17 years. But they weren't sitting idle. They were fighting in various wars. They were mercenaries and things of that nature, and all types of wars in Sicily and in the West. And basically, Ismail was sent to talk to the Sudots in Corfu. They promised them, which is what the Sudots wanted. The Sudots wanted sudi. So they promised them sudi. They promised them also some rations. They promised them some money. And basically, the Sudots left Corfu and headed towards the Pashalik to join the Ottoman forces against Ali. What happened though was Ismail really didn't provide the rations that he talked about, and basically the Sudots started to starve to a certain degree, and then they took and did what they normally would do, is they went into the mountains and basically started taking over the areas that they had before and imposing taxes on the local, in this particular case, Orthodox population of Christians, who in fact themselves had sided with the Sultan at that particular time. So it was a complete insult doing what they did. So the Sudots were in sort of a bad situation. However, Ali, being who he is, okay, and he was a brilliant tactician, a very cunning individual, basically decided to speak to the Sudots, have them meet with his people, and try to convince them to go on his side. Now these are the people who hated him. And basically after they sat down, and after he promised them sudi again, and also promised to give them some money, they joined his particular side. Now, at that time, what was happening is, since a lot of the forces were going with the Sultan, there was a lot of people going against Ali in Yanina and all the rest of that. What happened was, let's go to the next one. I just want to give you a little bit of feeling for what's going on. What's happening here is, this is the old Castro, okay, or fortification, castle of Yanina. And this particular area here is the inner court. So this is the town. There was obviously here, like I said, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious community. There was, of course, a Judaic section as well as an Orthodox section and a Muslim section. This is where he had basically his inner court and his mosque and his housing and his harem and all the rest of that. So what took place was that they joined forces, and then there was almost a reversal. You had all of a sudden the Sudetes went into the mountains. There was all types of guerrilla warfare. They combined with the partisan forces of Ali. And understand, these people, although they were different religions, they spoke to a certain degree the same language, different dialects, but they spoke a similar language. And my friend who's sitting here always liked to say about the Ioanninites, and you know who I'm talking about, who's sitting in this particular location. Mr. Gikas always says, Hellenic history never talks about the Ioanninites, who are these great people relating to the revolution. So what happened was, over time, there was a reversal. In fact, you had all these warriors now who knew every mountain pass, who knew every ravine, and regardless of the forces that were taking place with regards to the Sultan going after them and all the rest of that, it basically was a stalemate. And the Sultan got ticked off at Ismail. He still wanted, obviously, to give him the area like he promised him. But basically, he said, hey, listen, you and these pashas can't, in fact, control this particular area. And then what he did was he spoke to Khurshid. Khurshid was one of these great generals. He was a pasha at the time. He was made the pasha a little bit earlier of Tripolitsa or the Morea. Okay, so if you know the map, he basically took over the area that I pointed to that used to be Veli's area, the son of Ali. And Khurshid was a fantastic warrior, and he said to him, "Listen, I want you to take over the battle against Ali because this thing is not going right." But he had heard, because the word was starting to get out, that there may be some type of trouble with the Orthodox population in the Morea. There may be some revolutionary type of activities. He had heard some things about the Figikia or the Friendship Society. So this was around January or so. He asked Khurshid to go around the Morea to check out what was going on, and in fact to see if these things were true. And then there wasn't really that much action in January of 1821. So he reported back to the Sultan, said it seems okay over here. And in March, early March of 1821, Khurshid went north now to the Ioannina area to take over the forces against Ali. This is the beginning of March of 1821. You know the rest of the story, because towards the end of March, all of a sudden the revolution broke out, and the revolution took hold, obviously, in the Morea, which Khurshid had left, and he had left it to some young person who basically didn't know what was going on. And within a few months, the whole Morea basically had risen up. The revolution obviously started not in March 25th of 1821. It started a little bit earlier. Some of the battles took place in Iliya, and certainly Kalamata was the first major battle before the war. And I'm bringing this up, and I went through this long thing to make people understand again two things, actually three things, but let's say two major things. One had to do with the Sudetes, and the reason why I brought up the Sudetes was the Sudetes, in their exile for a period of 17 years, had an opportunity to meet with others who were also in exile. This includes Peloponnisos, and includes all the Clefs, basically, who, because of the Sultan's ferment in the early 1800s, also fled into the islands, to Zakynthos and to Corfu. And they mixed together as fellow soldiers, what have you, and created sort of like a Hellenic feeling that didn't exist before. In other words, before the Sudetes had left their area, they were really different types of people that now felt a sense of the revolution and understood what took place through those 17 years, felt a camaraderie to the other people. So when the revolution actually broke out, it did also break out in the north. Some of the greatest heroes, and my friend in the back will absolutely enjoy this comment. Some of the greatest heroes of the Hellenic Revolution were in fact his people. By the way, his people were from Himara. The Gikei were very famous Himara warriors. So that's to you, my friend. So with that introduction, again, two different things. As all the forces were basically trying to really concentrate on Ali, the revolution broke out. And in fact, had Khurshid stayed in Tripolitsa, and in fact, this thing with Ali did not take place, maybe it would have been a different Hellenic Revolution. Maybe it wouldn't have been a Hellenic Revolution at all. So, when people ask, why Ali? This is part of the reason why Ali. And also the fact that some of these people who were exiles, they combined into becoming gradually one type of people with one type of feeling. Thank you so much. This is the inner court of the Castro that I spoke. The outer court was basically the Castro itself. This is the inner court where Ali was. This is the mosque of Ali. Ali is buried right under that cage that you see there, except for his head. His head is in Constantinople. This is again the inner court. This is the Byzantine Museum of Yanina. Some of the cannons of the Castro. This is from he was killed actually in the island in the lake of Yanina. This is from the Museum of Ali, which is in the island in the lake. These two pistols here were some of his weapons. These are his personal weapons. This is again from the Ali Pasha Museum and some of the weapons that are there. Ali was killed. They shot him through some floorboards, and these are the floorboards. The reason why we're having this event in January is he was killed in January. Even though at the top you'll see it's February, but we're dealing with the Julian calendar. In the Julian calendar, he was killed in January. In the Julian calendar also, March 25th was actually in April. But we still celebrate on March 25th. This is an inhabitant of Yanina, print, very colorful individuals. This is a Suyot in Corfu, looking towards, outside. The destruction was in 1803, as I indicated. This is Fortispico, who is a proto-Padikaro. Labros Zavelas, who is one of the clans of the Suyots. This is Goudas, who is the aide-de-camp to Marcos Botsaris, the Botsarei, also Suyot clan. And in the museum, here's Ali's pipe, the one that he was smoking when he was in the lagoon. And there's the weapons and there's the gun. Catherine and I have been talking about this event for, it must be about 2 years. I tried to rope you in the first time when it had to do with the revolution, when you made the presentation at the cathedral. And I'm so glad that you're here tonight. And congratulations, by the way, for being made provost of NYU and some of the other great things and titles that you have. A lecture is from the Rutgers University, the Department of History program, Modern Greek Studies. I've had an opportunity to talk to Electra, and she's one of the new wave of Hellenic historians who have gotten into Ottoman history for a period of time in Greece itself. Ottoman studies weren't really studied that much, and Electra is part of that new wave. She did get a master's and a bachelor's degree in the University of Thessaly. The Ottomans, Hellenic nationalism, and European expansionism at the turn of the 18th century. The two Alis that we're referring to is Ali Pasha, okay, of Ioannina that we're talking about, and Muhammad Ali of Egypt.
Thank you so much, and I have to say that was a very humbling short presentation that really raised expectations. As to the quality of our talks, it's really an honor for me to be here with all of you today as somebody who focuses on the Eastern Mediterranean, the interaction of the Greek world with a broader empire during its final decades. It has been a really real pleasure try to move a little bit outside my direct area of expertise, which is the Aegean Sea and the big Greek islands, starting with Crete to the north, and trying to draw a connection that hopefully will make the story of Ali Pasha a little bit more meaningful from a broader perspective. So one more time, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much for inviting me. I think my presentation lost a little bit something of its surprise effect, but what I would like to start with today is this. In 2010, HBO launched its ambitious new series, Boardwalk Empire. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I was a big fan. It's a period drama with an irresistible pedigree. Terence Winter, the writer of The Sopranos, created Martin Scorsese, one of the executive producers, directed the pilot. So the show was both praised and criticized for its historical fastidiousness and attention to detail, which made it for some exquisite and for others plain monotonous or boring. Well, whether the stylistic choices of the show's creators deserve criticism or praise is beyond the scope of our discussion today. What is of interest to the historical context and protagonists we are going to discuss today is the historical context and protagonists the show has brought into life. Set in Atlantic City in the 1920s, during the first year of Prohibition. And what inspired the network to spend really lavishly in order to produce it was its creators' conviction that the once forgotten and romanticized 1920s, with all of their raw violence, mobility, and crime, would capture the audience's attention. Much of this faith was based on the series' main character, Ian Johnson, known as Naki. Naki Johnson was a political boss of the Republican Party who from 1911 to 1941 controlled all the vice in Atlantic City. He was Atlantic City's corrupt treasurer, described by some as living like a pasha, half political boss, half gangster, a charmer, a master manipulator, for some a charismatic persona, for many, a plain villain. More so than the real-life Naki Johnson, Boardwalk Empire's fictional persona of Naki Thompson has been constructed to be riddled with contradictions. To advance his personal ends, he has no hesitation to preach what he didn't follow. He supports women's rights while engaging in the trafficking of children. He commits vicious crimes but has no bias against blacks, Jews, or other minorities. In fact, he bases some of his most crucial alliances on the exploitation of his cultural tolerance and other people's bias in order to achieve his ultimate goal, wealth and political power. More so than the real-life Naki Johnson, and more so than the real-life Atlantic City in the 1920s, It is the public's fascination with this type of controversy, with these types of personas. It is HBO's largely historically accurate and yet somewhat orientalizing obsession with crime in New Jersey that has inspired me to talk a little bit about the show tonight, and this fictional Pasha of Prohibition America, before sharing a few thoughts about our actual Pasha of interest. That is Ali Pasha of Yanina, the Lion of Ioannina, as he was known among some. Rising to power initially as the leader of a band of brigands, challenging the limits of Ottoman rule over Epirus, Ali Pasha managed, as did many others with similar credentials, to infiltrate the administrative apparatus of the Ottoman Empire. He held various posts until he was eventually appointed Pasha, that is the ruler of a Sanjak, the governor of Sanjak, and the administrative domain of Ioannina. Much like the fictitious Naki Thompson, Ali Pasha, from that point onwards would attain a notorious reputation, both among contemporaries and in retrospective collective narratives, as the one controlling all the vice, not in Atlantic City, but in the Ottoman Epirus, a corrupt tax collector with great political ambitions and a soft spot for exotic women and vicious crime. And some of the popular representations of Ali Pasha speak for themselves. A villain who, however brutal, promoted learning, modernization, and literacy in his court with a pragmatism that pushed him far beyond his tribal origins. A Pasha whose Albanian name was associated with the promotion of the modern Greek Enlightenment and simultaneous vicious persecution of his Greek political rivals. So who was really Ali Pasha? I won't even pretend that my presentation today is about finding an answer, but it is worth trying to address, I believe, the essentialism of this lingering question. As Catherine Fleming's, Professor Fleming's emblematic work on the issue suggests, for those of you who are not already familiar with it, she literally wrote the book on Ali Pasha, which I highly recommend if you are in the mood for some further reading. So as Professor Fleming suggests, Ali Pasha straddled the three social worlds of 1, tribal bandit Albania, 2, the formal Ottoman bureaucracy, and 3, the Greek Enlightenment with regard to the promotion of literacy and commerce. Very much as Naki Johnson, real life or imaginary, the controversy around Ali Pasha stemmed from the innate conflict among these three worlds that overlapped but also violently clashed in real historical times and later on gave birth to rival retrospective historiographies of the region that have mutually exclusive understandings of Ali Pasha. So retrospective historiography has dragged his notorious image in order to accommodate an understanding of 18th century Epirus that agrees either with Turkish or Greek or Albanian nationalism. A retrospective understanding of Epirus that leaves behind, however, precisely what seemed to be the essence of Ali Pasha's era. The region itself, as a culturally and politically mixed synthesis that self-identified first and foremost with its own complex, complicated, controversial, and at times violent geography. He was, after all, Ali Pasha that is, first and foremost, not Ali Pasha, the Albanian, the Greek, or the Turk, but Ali Pasha Tepelana, Ali Pasha of Yanina. By all that, I don't mean to refer to late 18th century Epirus under Ali Pasha through the retrospective lens of a rosy and ahistorical multiculturalism. Far from it. What I'm trying to argue is that we cannot really decipher the enigma of his existence without taking into consideration the much larger historical processes that surrounded him, historical trajectories that were in themselves riddled with contradictions. So let us consider together a few things about Ali's world. First, the Ottoman state. We refer to it when talking about Ali Pasha, when talking about the Greek Revolution, but what was really the Ottoman state in the early 19th century? Although the Ottoman state is often confused with the Turkish state, the dynasty's claim to power was based on a medieval understanding of the world that has very little, nothing really, to do with Turkish nationalism. According to that understanding of the world, the ruler did not represent the ruled, not even the elite among the ruled, but the will of God. It is widely accepted among historians that for most of its existence, the Ottoman state made no claim to represent the population, Muslim, non-Muslim, regardless. The Ottoman state ruled over its population for most time of its existence. The Sultan, the leader, was divinely appointed and as such claimed the right to rule over Muslims and non-Muslims. But with this power came also responsibility to protect his own interests by ensuring the stable balance of the correct social order, Nizam-i Alem, a hierarchical society that in real life did not necessarily exist. As such, there were many exceptions to the rule, but in principle at least, guaranteed the maintenance of Pax Ottomanica. So, contrary to popular lore, during the so-called golden era of its existence, that is the 15th to 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was not centralized. Order was to be found in the three components of the empire. A, dynastic legitimacy. B, relative control over regional elites and by implication regional resources. And the maintenance of a well-regulated notion of cultural diversity, which was deeply hierarchical, with Islam forming the top of the socioeconomic pyramid, in theory at least. It was a highly hierarchical society, but it wasn't a monolithic society. This perception of order was not based on a centralized modern notion of the state. The modern notion of the state did not really exist at the time, but on a matrix of loose relations between state and socioeconomic forces, center and periphery, local and broader networks. So why did I make this long and a little bit dull, perhaps, introduction to what was the Ottoman state? Because the era of Ali, the late 18th century, the eventful 18th century, as it is known in the historiography, the era of Ali Pasha, is broadly known as the era when the Ottoman state started to change. When the early modern perception of order was undermined violently, both from within and both from without. From the regional perspective, the period is commonly described as the era of the Ions. What that means is the era of the notables. The era of conquest came to a halt, and the Ottoman state struggled to transform from a semi-feudal, constantly expanding war machine to a semi-sedentary modern state. And the state could not do so without the help of regional notables such as Ali Pasha. Hence, Ali Pasha of Yanina, among others, gained many privileges during this transformation, involving, among other things, the collection of taxes, very much like Naki Thompson again in the 1920s in America, often at the expense of the local peasantry. In many ways, Ali Pasha was the product of this negotiation over state power and land, as were the growing grievances among the peasantry and merchant classes that would contribute to the explosion of a series of rebellions in both the Balkans and Anatolia in the decades leading to the Greek Revolution. This historical trajectory, the era of Ali Pasha, the era of the Greek Revolution, created a vicious circle for the Ottomans. Provincial unrest forced the state to rely on notables such as Ali Pasha and his regional militia, fueling their ambition that they could eventually become themselves the state. The 18th century, however, was not eventful only from the Ottoman perspective. The circulation of goods, money, people, and ideas created pressures for and expectations of change around the globe. From North America to France and from South America to Russia, intensified the heated conflict over representation, land, and control that challenged dynastic understandings of prosperity and order. From the Greek Revolution to the French Revolution, and from the American Revolution to the many uprisings that troubled the Ottomans, one could argue that all of these clashes and changes were part of the same circle. It would be simplistic, to say the least, however, to describe this growing global turmoil as the linear path to more inclusive political systems. From the perspective of the many, the massive political changes of the late 18th century created uncertainty and chaos that led to the emergence of new hierarchies and to the rise of a number of all-powerful individual actors. As a case in point, since we talk about Corsica and the Ionian a little bit, a very well-known, certainly more well-known than Ali Pasha himself, leader, the French commander Napoleon Bonaparte, in 1798, found himself in Ottoman Egypt, invaded Ottoman Egypt, determined to extend the reach of French influence. But despite defeated Mamluk troops, he was soon to face a rebellious local Egyptian population and forced to withdraw. This created a vacuum to be filled by another Ali, not Ali Pasha of Yanina, but another Ali of paternal Albanian descent, Muhammad Ali of Kabbalah, nephew of another notable, Ayaan Chorbazi, tax collector from Kabbalah. Muhammad Ali was among the forces sent to reoccupy Egypt after the fall of French regime in the name of the Ottomans, and turning his own semi-brigand Albanian forces into the center of a localized state bureaucracy. Muhammad Ali managed to eliminate his opponents, and in 1805 became the Wali, the governor of Egypt. Why did I choose to refer to these two Alis today? Well, because there are many similarities between the two. Similarly to Ali Pasha, Muhammad Ali would serve the Ottoman center to advance his interests and would turn against it when he felt confident enough to do so. After expanding his authority over Africa, he was asked by the Sultan for support in putting down the Greek Revolution. Though not directly, it was over the decades spanning the Greek Revolution that the stories of Ali Pasha of Yanina and Muhammad Ali of Kabbalah, and later on of Egypt, crossed. Ali Pasha's ambition, as we all know, most of us know, culminated right before the revolution and with the indirect support of the French for a while, who, discouraged by their Egyptian troubles, saw in the Pasha of Epirus a potential ally in advancing their own geostrategical goals. So for a while, Ali Pasha and Greek Suliotes entertained the idea of anti-Ottoman coalition. But, as the story goes, Ottoman forces eventually defeated Ali Pasha in his own lands, leading him to his own death in 1822. And it was then, during the Greek Revolution, Muhammad Ali's turn to take over, recruited by Sultan Mahmud II to put down the rebels. Initially successful, Muhammad Ali's forces would be stopped eventually by a united European front in the well-known Battle of Navarino in 1827. The Pasha would lose almost all of his fleet, but for his service, he was given for 10 years the governorship of Crete. So for the majority Greek island, the period of Muhammad Ali constituted in many ways a reflection of Ali Pasha's rule over Epirus, enjoying the reputation of ruthless modernization, that of a ruthless modernizer. His administration was associated with a violent imposition of the Pasha's version of law and order, but also with a hierarchical understanding of religious equality that promoted the learning of the Greek language against Ottoman precedent and tried to gain the loyalty of Greek Orthodox Cretans, initially by force, and later on in the name of a joint anti-Ottoman coalition. More successful than Ali Pasha, Muhammad Ali would eventually lose Crete but gain Egypt. Though he had initially nothing to do with the land of the Nile, in the Egyptian collective imagination, Muhammad Ali is considered by many as the father of Egyptian nationalism. By others, he is seen as yet another autocrat, perhaps as one of the most successful ones to emerge in the end of the age of the Ions. So what both of these stories have in common is that they were essentially a reflection of worlds in transition, both in a dynamic relationship with their external environment and through internal evolution or revolution. Beyond the exaggerated or not brutality, charisma, and achievements of figures such as Napoleon, Ali Pasha, or Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the change realized at the turn of the 18th century was not really, I would like to argue, about them. It was about the millions of people struggling to survive or even to thrive in the shared space of shifting jurisdictions, in a complex matrix of alliances and rivalries shaped by continuously remapping worlds. By demands for representation, by efforts to resist, by efforts to survive. So some of the actors of late 18th century changing worlds were notorious, like Ali Pasha or Muhammad Ali. Most of them were anonymous. And perhaps, and I would like to conclude with that thought, given the complexity of that era, of the few notorious Ions and the many anonymous actors, perhaps it is not a coincidence that in the age of clashing empires and massive change, it was neither Muhammad Ali of Egypt nor Ali Pasha of Yanina, but semi-brigands, professional militants, semi-Ions, semi-notables of a lesser reputation initially at the time that found themselves leading what would become, against all odds, one of the early 19th century's most successful national revolutions. The revolution of the many, largely anonymous actors, the Greek Revolution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Let me say a couple of things. One that relates also to my family. Muhammad Ali's son, Ibrahim Pasha, was actually in 1825, after he had conquered and put down Crete. He did come into the Morea, and one of the first battles that took place was the Battle of Maniaki, which in Greek history is called the modern Battle of the 300, where Papaphlesis died, as well as Capitan Kefalas. At that time he was a general, General Kefalas. Kefalas is known as, if you ever saw the picture of someone planting a flag on Tripolitsa, right at the top, that's basically Capitan Kefalas. My grandfather's grandfather and his brothers did fight in the Battle of Maniaki. One of the Katsei, one of the Katsus clan, basically fell in Maniaki. Actually, Yanakis Katsus. So I thought I'd bring that up. The other thing I wanted to bring up is a slight joke, but in some ways not. Because there was somebody who said he was from Mani. Napoleon Bonaparte was from, his family was from Mani. Many people say, of course, that's not true, but that's okay. I decided to make that my joke. And from my perspective, I believe in that type of stuff.
Well, he was from
Yeah, he was from Corsica. The Maniatis came into Corsica in like the late 1600s because of their wars, etc. The next person I'm going to introduce is basically, this particular event revolves around her. Because in many ways, I did from the time I was a youth like this particular part of history, all types of history. But also, I did get a copy of your book, and Hassan Bibarai, who's here, who I sit down with every week and we drink coffee, handed me this book, I would say about 3 years or so ago. I did read it. I thought it was brilliant, and it is. And that's why I reached out to you, by the way, a couple of years ago during the Hellenic Revolution. Read her biography, it's just too extensive. It'll take a whole night, basically, to talk about Catherine Elizabeth Fleming. She's one of the most fantastic historians that exist, quite frankly, in my opinion, and the opinions of a lot of people. She is the Alexander Onassis Professor of Hellenic Culture and Civilization in the faculty of NYU, fantastic historian. And again, the provost, recently, I guess, you were made provost, you were the assistant provost. Just read her biography, it's amazing. Dr. Fleming.
So I have to say, you've managed something unique. You may not have noticed that we're in the same building as the Republican Women's Club. On the eve of the inauguration, a business association talking about Ali Pasha. I mean, could it get weirder than that? I don't think it could get weirder than that. So it's with some trepidation that I hear that this event revolves around me. So it's an event of great weirdness. Now, one thing that both of the people who've spoken before me have alluded to is sort of the paradoxical nature of Ali Pasha. At the risk of insulting you, I'm actually going to assume that not everybody shares Lou's sort of hobbyist obsession with Ali Pasha. So forgive me if I'm telling you something that you already know. When I give you just a brief historical outline, which is that the territory that today is modern Greece was, until the Greek War of Independence, part of the Ottoman Empire. And the transition from a world of the Ottoman Empire to the world of modern Greece took a long time. It took more than 100 years. It wasn't that one day there was the Ottoman Empire and the next day there was Greece. And one of the things that is important about people like Ali Pasha is that he existed during that moment of change. So he had one foot in the world of the Ottoman Empire and another foot in the world, not simply of modern Greece, but as Electra has pointed out, in the world of nation states. Greece, by no stretch of the imagination, is the only country that decides to have a war of independence at this time. The French do it in 1789, the Americans do it in 1776, and the Greeks, just after the Serbs, get around to doing it in the first part of the 19th century. And these events are all part of a historical sequence. If you look at them from the perspective of Greek history, which I suspect many of you in this room do, because some of you in this room may even have had a Greek education, the story is told somewhat differently. That there was a horrible, oppressive Ottoman Empire that had nothing to do with its time except make the Greeks feel miserable. And then at some point in time, in March of 1821, the Greeks decided we've had enough, 400 years of slavery, and they had a revolution. That's a nationalist history, and it's a false history, but it's a very nice and touching history. And I'm not going to rain on your parade if it's the history that you like. In any event, so Ali Pasha. So as you've heard, he was an Albanian Ottoman who at his height ruled over much of what today is Epirus, Thrace, and Macedonia. He was born around 1740, we don't know for sure, and he died in battle at the age of 82, when famously in 1822 he was shot through the floor of this upper chamber in which he had barricaded himself from the Ottoman troops. And that would hurt, really, if you think about the logistics of that. We hope it was a quick death, or not, depending on whether you were raised on a nationalist history. So, despite being very, very poor as a child, Ali Pasha's father died when he was 13, and his family was pretty much rendered destitute. Ali was, to say the least, upwardly mobile. With the help of a super overbearing mother, she was like the original power bitch mother. I can use that word, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah? It's a technical term. She really was an unbelievable woman. You'll hear about her a little bit more in a minute. He also worked really hard, and he married smart. And most of all, he was incredibly brave, and as a consequence, he managed to become first the Pasha of Trikala in 1787, and a year later took control of Ioannina, which remained his base of operations until he was shot in the crotch in 1822. So we, especially those of us, and that's not me, who had a Greek education, we probably think of Ali Pasha as simply an enemy to the Greeks. But he wasn't just that. He played a super complicated historical role at the time of the Greek War of Independence. And his whole career and character were full of contradictions. And if I were to name my paper something, I would name it The Contradictions of Ali Pasha. He was a fierce ruler who visitors systematically describe as gentle and effeminate. He was a highly local individual. Those of you who are Greek will know the term topikismos. He was completely embedded in the village from which he came and in the mountains that were so familiar to him, but he sought international renown. And he was a total barbarian. Where's the lovely singer of our song? Who also gained a reputation as being highly enlightened. And these contradictions became clear pretty much the moment you laid eyes on him. And Lord Byron, in his famous epic poem, from which this evening's event, I gather, takes its name, the poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, describes Ali's gentle, almost feminine face and bearing. And I'm going to do an old trick, which is read aloud to you so that I don't have to write as much of the paper myself. This is a quote from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. In marble-paved pavilion, where a spring of living water from the center rose, whose bubbling did a genial freshness fling, and soft voluptuous couches breathed in repose, there Ali reclines, a man of war and woes. Yet in his lineaments you cannot trace, you can't see on his face. While gentleness her milder radiance throws, along that aged and venerable face, the deeds that lurk beneath and stain him with disgrace. So Byron's whole thing was like, wow, he just looks so gentle and nice, and I mean, he's smoking all the time, so he's very chill. But Byron is saying, who would know that someone who looks so nice and calm as that? Now, those of us who've heard about him, we look at that and we think, wow, he looks like a fierce. But actually, look, if someone said, here's Santa, in his off hours, it's summer, he's in Santa's boat. So he looks really nice and relaxed. And this is Byron's point, right? It's like, who would suspect someone who looks like this of being so brutal? And almost all visitors commented on how calm and kind he looked, how fragile and feminine and even beautiful. And they also commented, as I just have, on what a huge contrast there was between the way he looked and the way he behaved. Gentle on the outside and a horror in many ways on the inside. And his life was indeed one of great contrasts. He wanted to please the outside world. He had the admiration of figures such as Napoleon, and at the same time he was famous for his atrocities, the word of which also spread far. Now, the features of his childhood read like a fairy tale by the brothers Grimm. He had an evil stepmother, he was a penniless orphan, there were feuding villagers and family vendettas. And when his father died, Ali found himself poor and suddenly expected to provide for his widowed mother and sister. And at this point, he was somewhere between the age of 9 and 15. The family had many enemies, and Ali's many stepbrothers and stepsisters, because his father had more than one wife, pushed him aside and took what little inheritance he was due. And faced with this hostile environment, his mother, who had the name Kamko, quickly took up the reins of a masculine life. And this is what one contemporary observer says of Ali's mother. During the lifetime of her husband, she gave no signs of being qualified to act the part of a heroine, but no sooner were her husband's eyes closed in death than her latent spirit blazed forth. She abandoned at once the habits of her sex. She threw aside the distaff and the veil, the thing that you weave with. She tosses it aside, she rips off her veil, and she appeared in arms. With an Amazonian spirit, she put herself at the head of her late husband's remaining followers. And there's a whole psychodynamic that I won't trouble you with, Lou referred to it as well, around Ali and his relationship with his mother, who is a super scary, super overbearing person who, when Ali was young, she was the victim of a rape. And it is this rape that he later goes on to avenge when he kills every single person in a village. But if Kamko suddenly, upon her husband's death, behaved like a man, she began to treat her son, Ali, like a woman. And we have many accounts of her mocking him for his weakness, telling him that he should be the one to weave instead of fight, and also telling him, as one historian has put it, that, quote, the proper place for such a sissy is the harem. But Ali did not remain a sissy for long. No matter what people think of him, his was a remarkable trajectory. He went from being a fatherless rural mountain brigand to having fame all over Europe. He became someone about whom people on Inauguration Eve 2017, people sit around and give lectures. I mean, that is no small measure of fame. I mean, even if it is the product of one person's obsession. For the 30 years that he ruled Ioannina, he was determined to make his mark not just on history, but also on the lands over which he governed. The British traveler, Lord Broughton, who traveled through Epirus at the time, wrote with great admiration of Ali's public works programs. Here's what he said. Ali has built bridges over rivers, he's raised causeways across the marshes, he's laid out roads and adorned the countryside and the towns with new buildings. And by many wholesome regulations, he has acted the part of a good and great prince, without perhaps a single other motive than that of his own aggrandizement. So this is another paradox. This figure, who's reviled as a barbarian, was viewed by some as a good prince, an enlightened ruler who tried to improve his lands and his people, even if he did it just to make himself look good. And of course, since before Roman times, these are exactly the sorts of things that you do if you're a world ruler. Ambitious public works programs, improving communications and trade routes, and installing all of the infrastructure that communications and trade need. hotels, inns, causeways, roads. And this was sort of the creation of this region as, I don't want to say modern, but as a proto-modern region, as a region that was connected rather than one of disparate villages. The first 2 decades of Ali's rule were a flurry of activity. He brought in European engineers who drained the swamps and marshes just north of Arta. He had tea houses and lodges established along the primary routes of travel. He paved the main road from Ioannina to Preveza on the Adriatic coast, and he made sure that there were hotels, inns, spread all the way along this route at like 1 hour intervals, so that you would always have somewhere to rest, like a rest stop on the thruway. He established a government-operated ferry over the Drin and other rivers, and he set up sentries and military lodgings in mountain passes to make them safer. Now, of course, Ali of all people knew very well how unsafe those mountain passes were, because after all, when he was a youth, he had been a mountain bandit who had made those very same passes very dangerous places indeed. He had been one of thousands of people in the region who had made a semi-legitimate living out of banditry. And those of you who are familiar with Greek history are familiar with the Clefts and the Armatoloi, the thieves who lived in the mountains, and the police force in the mountains that was there to stop the thieves from thieving. And these two groups actually became very similar to one another and acted in cahoots with one another. And whether you were on one side or the other sort of depended on where you were in any given transaction. And he's sort of the ultimate example of someone who makes a very successful transition from being a thief to a policeman in a very big way. He knew the mountainous terrain around Ioannina like the back of his hand, and just as when a youth he knew how to make it dangerous, how to find the very best hiding places for lying in wait for an innocent victim, once he ruled over it, he used that very same knowledge of the land to make it safe. Lord Hobhouse, the British traveler who visited in 1809 and 1810, reported that Ali Pasha made a point of visiting each and every village in his dominions at least one time each year. One of the very foundations of his power was this sort of intimate knowledge of his territory. And of course, it also makes a big impression on the people over whom you rule if you show up unannounced in their village from time to time. So this is another of the great contradictions of Ali. The person who brought law to his lands was also its greatest historic outlaw, Ali himself. Now, some people here may have heard me speak about Ali Pasha at the famous event 3 years ago, and I ask for your patience while I repeat a story that I recounted then, which is the story of the drowning of the Yanyot women. And this also is a story that is connected to a paradox and a contradiction. This is one of the most famous stories in the history of Ali Pasha and is thought to exemplify his great brutality. So as this story has it, Ali's oldest son, whose name was Mukhtar and was the Pasha of Lepanto, he was given to violent physical passions. He consequently pursued a wide array of women, and this aroused the jealousy of his wife, Pasho, who monitored his affairs by sending spies out after him. So she was at home, he was out doing his thing, and she sent people out to see what he was up to. And in the course of his philanderings, Ali's son, Mukhtar, is said to have fallen madly in love with a beautiful Greek woman. In these stories, she's always like a knockout. She's always unbelievably beautiful. Her name was Frosini. And although she was a married woman, she enjoyed a certain amount of freedom because her husband was a merchant and spent a good deal of time away from Ioannina. So it is that Mukhtar and Frosini became involved in a highly publicized and time-consuming extramarital liaison about which pretty much everybody in town knew. Frosini, it is said, was not quite as devoted to Mukhtar as he was to her, but she was flattered by the attentions of this very prominent citizen. And thinking to turn this connection to the Pasha's son to her material advantage, she persuaded Mukhtar to give her a very valuable and distinctive ring that he always wore. I guess she saw this ring, I don't know, the bedside table. He took, who knows what he does with the ring. She said, I love your ring. That's a beautiful ring. I love you so much. It would mean so much to me. And he, being a guy, thought, oh, she loves me so much, I'm going to give her the ring. Now, Mukhtar, blinded by his obsession with Frosini, didn't see this request as the simple act of gold digging that it obviously was, and he gave her the ring. He was touched that she wanted to own one of his personal possessions, and Frosini immediately went to a jeweler, turned the ring over, and asked him to sell it on her behalf. And the jeweler, who immediately recognized the great value of the ring, went straight to the only place in town where he could find a buyer wealthy enough to afford such an item. And thus the jeweler ended up at the palace, from whence, of course, the jewel had originally come, and brought the ring before none other than Pasha, Mukhtar's wife, with whom in the past he had done business. Ooh. Pasha quickly recognized the ring, and she made the jeweler tell her how it had come into his possession. And she flew into a jealous rage when she learned the story and vowed revenge against Frosini. Pasha's next stop was to her father-in-law, Ali Pasha. Visiting him, she begged that he punish Frosini for stealing her man. Ali had Frosini taken into custody and then told Pasha to make up a list of all the other women in Ioannina with whom she thought Mukhtar might be infatuated. And without delay, she gave him a list of 17 names. And soon these women too were rounded up and thrown into the dungeon along with Frosini. All of them were sentenced to death. And a few nights later, the women were taken to the shores of the lake, forced into boats, tied up in sacks, rowed out to deep water, and thrown overboard as adulteresses. Now, some version of this story is almost certainly true, if somewhat embroidered over the years to give it this nice narrative perfection. And over time, it's come to be important, not just as an anecdote about the cruelness of Ali Pasha, but it's also become important to the Greek national consciousness. Frosini's body was ultimately recovered from the lake, and it was buried at the monastery of Agion and Argyron in Ioannina. The Orthodox Church has declared Frosini a Christian martyr, and Frosini has been adopted as a symbol of rebellion in the Greek fight for independence from the Ottoman regime. And those of you who are Greek will know the song, Those of you who, have you heard the story of Frosini from Ioannina, who was drowned along with the 17 other women? And in the song, it's, your your house is weeping for you, that's what they really regret, is that such a beautiful woman was killed. So here's another really interesting contradiction and paradox of the sort that we see all the time when people talk about the Greek Revolution, that this Greek adulteress has become a symbol of Greek bravery against the Ottomans. I find this very, very interesting. In the peculiar transformation of this beautiful Greek woman into a freedom fighter for the Greek cause, we see a very familiar trope, that death, any death at the hands of the Ottomans, became an act of resistance and an act of martyrdom, no matter what the actual specifics of the situation were. So, all of this to say that there are many paradoxes and contradictions that swirl around Ali Pasha. I've pointed only to a few of them here. A gentleman who was brutal, a barbarian who was described as a good prince. Other paradoxes that we could talk about in 3 years when we have another Ali Pasha event include the fact that figures such as Yannis Koletis, who was the first prime minister of independent Greece, was one of Ali Pasha's closest friends and confidants, who was actually his personal physician. Another paradox is the fact that Ali Pasha claimed, probably falsely, to be a member himself of the Filikiateria, the secret society that laid the plans for Greek independence. So while for many people here today, particularly those of Greek origin, Ali Pasha may be thought of as the consummate enemy of the Greeks and of all things Greek, I don't think this really tells the story. Now, my point this evening hasn't been to convince you that he was a nice guy. He most definitely wasn't. But my point is to show that in every history there are contradictions and complexities, and as a professional historian, I'd make the argument that it's precisely those contradictions and complexities that make history worth studying. And the reason for this is because real history, complex history, works a little contrary to the way in which national histories work. National histories, like Hollywood movies, like their characters to be clearly black or white, bad or good, villains or heroes. But as I think we all know from our own lives, things usually are far more complex than that. The thing that makes Greek history so interesting to me is that it is as well. And it's in that light, ultimately, that I think we should see the paradoxes of Ali Pasha. Thank you very much.
Please, another round of applause for Ali. Among the events that will take place, we've been having basically an event every month. Our next event will relate to the food industry, which will be in March. In February. In March, we will do the design, development, and construction event, which is always a fantastic event. In April, we will do again, in concert with the Harlem Chamber of Commerce, we will do our East Mediterranean Harlem Blues concert, like we did last year, so we're going to have a second year with that. In May, on May 29th, we will have an event relating to the fall of Constantinople, and that will be our last event of the year. So we've had a lot of events. We had the Hagia Sophia event more recently, also for those who were here. So we do both cultural and business type of events. We've been around for about a year, but we've gotten a lot of enthusiasm by the people who've come to our events. We hope you can join us at the next events, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.